seen the people perish. And it goes on talking about when we get involved in the things of the Lord, that's where our strength is. That's where our happiness is. And I just want to sort of go from there. Maybe talking about prayer and fast. What's the point of having a prayer and fast? The idea is to put the natural aside for a little while and concentrate and uplift the spirit. And as we go through life, we find that all the stuff out there, it has an effect on us. We're in the world, but we're not part of the world. But we have to rub shoulders with it as we go about our daily business of providing for our families, etc., working. And there's the old saying, you are what you eat. We eat rubbish and eventually you get sick. The things around about us affect us. One of the things I remember is accents. When you go different parts of the world, everyone's got their own accent. Even in Britain, there's different accents where in different parts of Britain in itself. But one thing I noticed is that when we came over to the UK, you watched the children, and the youngest child was the first one to take on the accent of the area. So the 5-year-old was most probably a month to 2 months maximum. And gradually you watch the children. The older the child, the longer it took. And my daughter was 9, and she was most probably the last one to become really English. And it took her around about 9-10 months, and then she was proper English, not like us Aussies, etc. So you take on the stuff that's around about, and unfortunately, that's part of life. And I think prayer and fast is like a spring clean. Now, our day today in business is we get up in the morning, we maybe do a little bit of a tidy and a bit of a clean. Once a week we do a bigger clean. But then there's a time of the year where you do a spring clean. You get in and you really clean out the old house. And that's a little bit like what we're trying to do at the moment. There's all this stuff that's affecting us as we go about our daily walk with the Lord. And we want to be as close to him as we can, to be like Jesus, we sing. So something along that lines is what I'm thinking about. In 1 Samuel, we see there was a guy called Eli. He was the high priest of the day, and it was his responsibility to keep everything in check between Israel and the Lord. And he was there to minister. And we see that his children, he doesn't keep a real good handle on his kids. And his kids go awry, and they start to do things that are wholesome before the Lord. And they were representing God. And they were letting the side down. And they were getting into things that really they shouldn't have got into. It was all about serving the flesh and not serving the Lord. And he didn't keep a check on them. He allowed them to go off on a tangent. And we see that this young lad comes along. You can read it in 1 Samuel. And it is about Samuel, the life of Samuel, and how he's dedicated to the Lord. And he had a good vision. He wanted to do the right thing. And you saw how he served the Lord right from the beginning. And in Samuel 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, it says, and Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli. And the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. So the way people started to conduct their life and not really serve the Lord as the Lord had asked, they had lost their way. They started to lose the way. And we all know the stories around Israel. They were told not to take on anything from around about. those people around about, the nations around about. Don't get involved in them. Be separate. Come out and be separate from them. And of course they did. They started to take on, and we see time and time again that the Lord sort of tried to steer them the right way, and prophets came along and they let the side down again and again. And in the end, the Lord goes, guys, you go, you want to serve this wooden statue here or the stone god there, you do that, see how it goes. It didn't go well. Israel disappeared off the face of the earth almost. When I started my working life, my job was I went into the mechanics, and I was the diesel mechanic on heavy goods vehicles. And if I say to you, what is the use of oil in a car engine? I bet you pretty well everyone will say it's to lubricate that engine. Everyone agree with that? Is there another reason for oil in your engine? There is a couple of things. It helps keep the temperature. But the third, one of the main things is that oil keeps dirt in suspension. All the contaminants that manage to filter into the engine, it holds in suspension. That's why you change your engine oil, because it can only cope with a certain amount of dirt, and that engine needs to be cleaned out. It needs to have an oil change. The filter needs to be changed, and you need fresh oil. Our walk in the Lord is very much like that. Just going back to the engine, two things shorten the life of an engine. Start stopping, so letting an engine go cold and starting it up and heating it up. And the biggest killer, which could half, if not even more, the engine life, is dirt in that engine, not changing the oil. Again, with our walk in the Lord, it is very much the same thing. If we allow our life to be contaminated, and we are constantly contaminated by the world, and we've got to sort of clean that off all the time. It's like having a wash. You come home and you might have been in the garden or sort of as a mechanic, and you sort of have grease up your sleeves, and you come in, and you sort of wash your hands and clean everything before you sat down, because you didn't want to bring the day's stuff home with you. We see that in Acts 2, verse 42. It says, and they continued steadfast in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in breaking of bread and in prayers. So right at the very beginning of the start of the church, they already knew that the importance of fellowship and being one as one body, to be together in everything they do, was such an important thing. In verse 46, it says, and they continued daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart. So they had a vision. They tried not to get distracted by all the things that were around. They wanted to focus in on the things of the Lord. We'll leave that one. Again, I just touched on this, that Israel was asked to be kept separate. And in 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 14, you can read it to the end, but I'm just going to do verse 14. It says, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion has light with darkness? They're not compatible. We aren't compatible with the world. You sort of show people what you're all about and what you do, and they go, oh, how did you manage to do that? They've got no understanding of the things of the Lord and how we should walk with the Lord, the type of relationship they should have with the Lord. It's all been contaminated. All the things that you hear from the churches, it's been contaminated with man's ideas of how you should serve God. And they are not the way that God has asked us to serve him. And I'll just leave you with one thought, and it's a little bit of a testimony. But I had a neighbour years ago, and her and her husband, they just lived across the fence. And her and her husband went to a Pentecostal group. And she's leaning over the fence one day and having a bit of a chat to us. And she says to me, she says, Bob, she says, I look at you, and she says, I see signs and miracles. She says, I see things happening in your life that are to do with God. She says, you pray about things and things happen. She said, I don't see that in my life. And I asked her a question. I said, but in your church, I said, I know you speak in tongues, but I said, that's not necessary to speak in tongues in your church. What it is, when I'm filled with the Spirit, it's that I give my heart to Jesus and I do this and I do that. And I said, all these things, I said, are compromised. They're all compromising the word of God. And it's almost like taking the power of something and you keep dividing that power. And eventually it has got no effect in someone's life. It's like a battery. You got a battery, you start to run lots of things off it, and all of a sudden it can't cope anymore. And that bright light is dim. And the same with our walk with the Lord. If you compromise the word of God, you find that eventually it has no effect in your life. And that's what she saw. In her life, she said, I didn't see these things. I didn't see the miracles and the signs. I pray about stuff and it doesn't happen. And I said, well, maybe you're in the wrong place. So again, time of prayer and fast is to realign ourselves, to clean out all that junk, to align ourselves with the Lord and do what the Lord. Neglect the flesh for a little while,